The wind carried the scent of salt and sugar across the Jamaican plantation, mixing with the cries of children and the harsh cracks of the overseer's whip. The air was thick with the weight of toil, with years of blood and sweat that had soaked into the very earth. It was a place where silence reigned, but beneath that silence simmered something darker. The mansion that loomed over the fields, so proud and pristine, was a fortress built on the backs of the enslaved, and its walls echoed with the screams of those who had been forced into servitude. But within those walls, hidden beneath the veneer of wealth and power, one woman's heart beat with something more than fear. Leah. She worked in the kitchen, out of sight, but never out of mind. She had lived her entire life under the shadow of the Howards, the cruel masters who had stolen everything from her. But Leah had learned that the greatest weapon of all was patience, the slow, steady burn of a mind that bided its time. She had suffered, yes, but her pain had birthed something far greater than submission. Vengeance. Tonight, the Howards would sit at the table, blind to the terror they were about to endure. Tonight, Leah would serve them justice on a platter, a meal they would never forget. And the taste of it? It would be as bitter as the years of torment she had endured. Before we descend into this dark chapter of history, I want to know where you're watching from. What time is it where you are? Drop a comment below, and if stories like this captivate you, hit subscribe, because what you're about to hear has been buried in silence for far too long. Leah stood in the heart of the Howard estate, her hands deep in flour and dough, her back bent from years of servitude, but her heart unbroken. The kitchen was her domain, the one place where her actions were unnoticed, where the masters could not see her, where she could hide her thoughts and her rage. She had learned to become invisible in their eyes, a shadow in the corners of their lives, always serving, but never seen. But today, the scent of the food in the air carried with it something far darker than the usual smells of roasting meat and sweet bread. She had spent years perfecting her craft, her hands creating dishes that pleased the Howards' perfectly seasoned stews, fresh bread, succulent roasts. She had become so skilled in her craft that Mr. Howard, in his drunken arrogance, had boasted to his guests that Leah's cooking was the finest in Jamaica. Yet all that praise, all that luxury, had come at the cost of her family, her dignity, her very soul. Leah's thoughts were sharp as a blade, cutting through the layers of her past and the present reality she faced. She had been enslaved as a child, forced to work on this very plantation, to serve the whims of her masters. She had seen families torn apart, children ripped from their mothers' arms, fathers whipped for the smallest mistake, and women treated like animals. Leah had been no stranger to the brutality of the system. The Howards had stolen her childhood, her innocence, and in the process, they had unknowingly created her resolve. But it wasn't until they took Elijah that something inside her snapped. Elijah was her son, a boy who had been born into this hell. And despite the conditions, she had raised him with love, with care. But the Howards had decided that Elijah was to be sold off, shipped to another plantation like livestock. They saw no value in him except as a commodity, a way to increase their wealth. The moment they took him away, Leah had felt her heart break, but something else had awoken within her. It wasn't just the loss of her son, it was the final straw, the thing that broke her patience. She had watched so many suffer, so many die, but this time it was personal. They had taken her flesh, her blood, and her soul. As Elijah's cries echoed in her mind, Leah knew that something had to be done. She couldn't stand by and let them destroy her family. She couldn't let them think they had the power to break her. She moved with purpose through the kitchen, her hands steady as she prepared the evening's meal. Tonight's dinner would be no ordinary meal. It would be a feast, but not one that the Howards would ever forget. She had spent days preparing, carefully planning each dish, each flavor. The ingredients, the herbs, everything had been chosen for one reason only: revenge. Leah's eyes flickered to the corner where the butchered meat hung, its raw edges still gleaming in the dim light. She knew what she had to do. Tonight, the Howards would dine on something more than food. They would feast on the very thing that had been taken from her, her son. The thought churned in her stomach, but her resolve hardened. She was no longer a slave. She was a mother. and she would do whatever it took to make them suffer. Her hands moved quickly, deftly. She had prepared for this moment for years, and now it was here. The table was set, the candles were lit, and soon the masters would gather to indulge in their excess, oblivious to the dark twist of fate that awaited them. Leah stood back, surveying the meal she had prepared. The roast was golden and fragrant, the bread warm, the fruits fresh and ripe. She had made sure to give them everything they wanted, everything they expected. But the poison she had added, the secret ingredient they would never taste, would change everything. Tonight, they would dine on the consequences of their own cruelty. The Howards had always dined lavishly, their nights filled with the clink of crystal glasses, the sound of idle chatter, and the clattering of silverware against porcelain. Tonight, like so many before it, was no different, except for the air that hung thick with an unspoken tension. Leah stood just outside the dining room, the door slightly ajar, her eyes fixed on the scene within. Mr. Howard, sitting at the head of the table, raised his glass, a smug smile stretching across his face. He looked the part of a man who had everything, his dark eyes gleaming with pride as he glanced over his domain. His wife, Isabella, sat beside him, her face pale and gaunt, a woman whose beauty had long been eroded by the same cruelty she wielded with her sharp tongue. Their son, Thomas, sat at the other end, his demeanor spoiled and entitled, no regard for the lives that had been sacrificed to keep the family afloat. They laughed at trivial things, their voices like a symphony of indulgence. But Leah's gaze was fixed on Thomas, their son, their pride, who, only days ago, had been the last one to touch Elijah, the last one to look into her son's eyes before he was taken away, sold like a commodity. Thomas had mocked her son's protests, calling him weak. But in his eyes, Leah saw the arrogance that would be his undoing. He had no idea how close he was to his own demise. Her hand, pressed against the door frame, trembled slightly. But it wasn't fear, it was anticipation. The years of pain, of suffering under their hands, had led to this moment. A meal, a simple meal, one that would cost them everything. Leah had taken her time planning it. The meals she prepared had always been praised for their flavors, rich and complex. She had spent years perfecting her skills in the kitchen, learning the way the masters liked their food, how to make them smile with pleasure as they devoured what she had prepared. But this meal was different. It was meant to break them, to destroy them from within. With practiced precision, she had laced their food with a slow-acting poison. She knew the right amount, just enough to bring them to their knees, just enough to make them beg for mercy as they choked on their own arrogance. The pain they would experience would be slow, tormenting, but there would be no escape. This time, Leah had prepared the meal, but they were the ones who would be consumed. She glanced down at the platter of roasted lamb, its skin golden and crisp, the aroma drifting up to her nose, making her stomach churn. The irony of it was not lost on her. The lamb, tender and succulent, would be their last taste of life. Leah had seasoned it carefully, allowing the poison to soak deep into the meat, the very thing they desired most. Her thoughts wandered to her son, to Elijah, and the warmth of his embrace. She remembered the way he would smile at her, how his tiny hand would clutch hers whenever he was scared. He was taken too soon, robbed from her before he had the chance to grow. Leah could still hear his cries echoing in her ears. The pain of losing him never dulled, but it had given her a purpose. The sound of voices from the dining room pulled her back to the present. Mr. Howard was raising his glass in a toast, his voice booming across the table. "To another year of prosperity, to our hard work and success," he said, a patronizing smile on his lips. His words were meaningless to Leah. They had never worked a day in their lives. It was their wealth, their greed, that kept them in power. And it was that power that had destroyed her family, her people. Isabella nodded, her lips curling into a smile that never quite reached her eyes. She lifted her own glass, her hand trembling slightly. Leah watched her closely. There was a time when Isabella had been a picture of grace, but years of indulgence had turned her into a shadow of her former self. She had ignored the suffering of those around her, living in luxury while the slaves around her worked and died. But tonight, It was her turn. Tonight, she would see what it was like to lose everything. Thomas, sitting at the end of the table, grabbed the lamb with his hands, his fingers greasy with the juices. He ripped into the meat with a reckless abandon, oblivious to the pain it would bring. He was always the one who had treated the slaves with the most disdain, thinking himself above them, thinking his position made him untouchable. But Leah would show him what happens to those who believe they are invincible. The first few moments passed without incident. The Howards laughed, drank, and ate, their eyes focused on the food and the company. But as the meal wore on, Leah noticed something shift. Isabella's laughter faltered. Her hand, once steady, trembled as she reached for her wine glass. Mr. Howard, too, had become quieter. His face flushed, his movements sluggish. Thomas's once boisterous laughter turned to coughing fits, his face twisting in discomfort as he dropped his fork to the table. Leah stepped back from the door, her heart racing, a strange satisfaction creeping into her chest. The poison had begun its work, slow and insidious, eating away at them from the inside out. The first scream came from Isabella. It was a sound that cut through the laughter, through the air, as she clutched her stomach, her face contorting in agony. Her breath came in shallow gasps, and her skin paled. Thomas followed, his body jerking violently as the pain overtook him. Mr. Howard, who had always believed himself invincible, staggered from his seat, clutching his chest, his face going red with panic. Leah's pulse quickened. She could hear them now, their voices rising in panic. But there was no mercy, no escape. They would die as they had lived arrogant and unaware, thinking they were beyond reproach. Leah's hands clenched into fists as she heard them gasping for breath, their once confident voices now pleading. She could feel the weight of her vengeance, the weight of every tear she had shed for her son, every scar she had borne for their cruelty. The masters were dying, but so too was their legacy. In their final moments, Leah's plan was coming to fruition. She had served them their revenge, and now there was nothing left for them but the pain they had so long inflicted upon others. The house had grown eerily silent, the sharp sounds of suffering cutting through the air like a twisted symphony. Leah stood in the doorway, hidden from sight, watching the scene unfold before her. Her heart beat steadily, a rhythm of calm in the midst of chaos. She had spent so long dreaming of this moment, imagining the day when the Howards would pay for their cruelty. And now, as they writhed in agony, their once proud lives crumbling before them, Leah felt only a strange satisfaction, a sense of justice long overdue. The sounds of choking, gasping, and gurgling filled the room. Mr. Howard, his face now a deep purple, clawed at his throat, unable to draw breath. His body shook with spasms as the poison took hold, suffocating him slowly, cruelly. Isabella, once so poised and proud, was reduced to a quivering mess, her eyes wide with terror, her hands clutching at her chest in a futile attempt to stop the pain. Thomas, the spoiled son, had already collapsed, his face twisted in a grotesque grimace as he convulsed on the floor, his life slipping away in small, jagged gasps. Leah had given them their meal, a feast they had gorged themselves on without suspicion. The lamb, roasted to perfection, the bread golden and warm, the fruits fresh and ripe. It had all been perfect. The poison had been subtle, expertly laced into the meal. No one had suspected anything until it was too late. By the time they realized what was happening, the damage was done. But as she watched the Howards suffer, something inside Leah shifted. The satisfaction she had expected didn't fully come. Instead, she felt a strange emptiness settle in her chest. She had waited so long, built up so much anger, and yet, in the end, it felt like nothing could bring back her son. Nothing could fill the hole in her heart. The Howards were dying, but in their death, she saw no redemption, no justice, only the cold reality of what she had become in the pursuit of revenge. She had fed them their own son, but now, as she watched their bodies convulse on the floor, she realized that nothing would ever bring Elijah back to her. The pain of his loss was still fresh, still raw, and no amount of vengeance could heal it. She had taken their lives, but she could not take back what had been stolen from her. The sound of Mr. Howard's final breath broke her from her thoughts. His body went limp, his face frozen in the horror of his last moments. Isabella followed soon after, her body collapsing onto the table, her eyes wide in shock, her lips trembling as she gasped for one last breath. Thomas, too, fell silent, his body twitching once before stilling. The Howards were dead. The silence that followed was deafening. The world outside the house seemed to stop. The only sound, the faint rustle of the wind through the trees. Leah stood there, unmoving, her eyes fixed on the fallen bodies of the people who had tormented her, who had torn her family apart. The victory was hers, but it felt hollow, the weight of it crushing her. She had been patient, had waited for years, and now the moment had come. But what did it matter now? What did it change? The Howards were dead, but the scars they had left on her heart, on the hearts of her people, could never be erased. She had taken her revenge, but she knew deep down that it would never bring her peace. Leah turned away from the scene, her footsteps silent on the floor. She could hear the faint sounds of movement behind her as the other slaves, who had watched the entire ordeal from the shadows, began to stir. Some looked relieved, some uncertain. The power had shifted, the fear of the masters was gone. But now the reality of what had just transpired began to settle in. Leah had done what they all dreamed of doing, what so many had hoped for. But the aftermath was a strange, uncertain silence. "Leah." Zainab's voice broke through the quiet, her tone hesitant, filled with a mixture of awe and fear. "It's done?" Leah nodded, her voice low, steady. "It's done." Zainab stepped closer, her eyes scanning the bodies of the Howards. "We're free," she said softly, almost as if trying to convince herself. "But what now?" Leah didn't answer right away. The question hung in the air, heavy and unanswered. What now? The plantation was theirs. The Howards were gone. But freedom wasn't as simple as killing the oppressors. They had no plans, no clear path forward. The world was changing. But in the wake of their victory, there was still so much uncertainty. Leah took a deep breath and walked over to the table, where the final remnants of the Howards' meal lay. The lamb, now cold, its once pristine flesh marred by the poison, sat untouched. She reached for the carving knife, her fingers brushing the steel, and for a moment, she was still. The weight of it all, the pain, the loss, the vengeance, seemed to press down on her, and she felt the weight of it in every bone of her body. "I will leave," Leah said finally, her voice quiet but firm. "This place is no longer mine. The world is no longer theirs." Zainab nodded, understanding the gravity of her words. "We will go with you. We will leave this place behind. There is nothing for us here anymore." The slaves began to gather around, murmuring in quiet agreement. The time had come to leave, to move on, to find a new life, far from the chains of their past. As Leah stood there, gazing at the bodies of the Howards, she knew that this was not just the end of the battle, it was the beginning of something new. The road ahead was uncertain. But one thing was clear. They were no longer slaves. They were free. And in that freedom, there was a bitter taste, a sweet one, and a burning one. The price of their revenge had been high, but it had been paid in full. Leah turned, walking out into the unknown. The plantation, now silent, was behind her. The world lay ahead, waiting to be shaped by those who had long been silenced. And Leah, though scarred and broken, was ready to walk that road. The morning light filtered through the trees, casting a soft, golden glow over the once thriving plantation. The estate was quiet now, eerily still. The sounds of the masters, once so familiar, the clink of silver, the laughter at the dinner table, the snapping of the overseer's whip were all gone. In their place, there was only silence, thick with the weight of what had transpired. Leah stood at the edge of the estate, her eyes scanning the land she had once worked, the land that had been soaked with the blood, sweat, and tears of so many like her. The plantation was now theirs, but the victory felt hollow. She had killed the Howards, taken their lives, avenged her son, but in the aftermath, she felt a void, an emptiness that no amount of revenge could fill. The others had gathered behind her, a mix of uncertainty and hope in their eyes. Some were still in shock, unable to fully comprehend what had happened. Others were eager to move on, to escape the horrors of the past and build a new future. But Leah knew that freedom, no matter how hard won, was never as simple as walking away. They had fought for their lives, but now they had to fight for their place in the world. Zainab approached her, her expression somber but determined. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice soft. "The Howards are dead, but we're still here. The world outside this plantation hasn't changed. We can't just leave and hope it will all work out." Leah turned to face her, her eyes filled with the weight of their shared history. "We take what's ours," she said, her voice steady but heavy with the burden of leadership. "We rebuild. We make our own way, free from their chains." But even as she spoke, Leah knew that the path ahead would not be easy. The plantation was vast, its fields stretching endlessly before them. The wealth that had once belonged to the Howards was now up for grabs, but with that wealth came danger. The world outside would not simply allow them to take what they had earned. The masters may have been gone, but the system they had built, the system that kept the world in place, was still very much alive. As Leah and Zainab walked through the estate, they saw the remnants of the Howards' life. The grand house, now abandoned, its once pristine walls chipped and cracked. The gardens, once meticulously tended, now overgrown with weeds. The remnants of luxury were still scattered throughout. But it was clear that without the Howards, the estate was nothing more than a hollow shell. The slaves who had survived the rebellion moved through the estate in small groups, some cleaning, others gathering what they could. It was a strange, unsettling sight. For years, they had been forced to serve the Howards, to live in fear, to be nothing more than property. But now, they were free. The air was thick with the uncertainty of what that freedom meant. As Leah walked deeper into the plantation, she found herself at the edge of the fields where she had once worked. The rows of sugarcane stretched out before her, the familiar sight of the harvest now twisted by the memory of the labor that had built the estate. The soil was rich, fertile, but it had been tainted by the years of suffering. Zainab stood beside her, her eyes following Leah's gaze. "What now?" she asked again, her voice tinged with doubt. Leah paused for a moment, looking over the land. "We rebuild," she repeated, her voice quiet but firm. "But we do it differently. We take back the land. We make it ours." But even as Leah spoke, she felt the weight of what lay ahead. The Howards were gone, but the world outside their plantation was still governed by the same rules, the same systems that had kept them enslaved for so long. The masters were dead, but the fight for freedom was far from over. As the day wore on, Leah and the others began to move through the estate, preparing for what was to come. They would have to leave the plantation, find a new home, a new life. But for the first time, they could do so on their own terms. The sun began to set, casting a warm orange glow over the fields. The plantation, once a symbol of their oppression, now seemed empty, its grandeur fading in the twilight. For the first time, Leah felt the weight of the world lift from her shoulders, even as she knew the road ahead would be long and uncertain. But there was something else now, something that had never been there before: hope. As the slaves gathered around the remains of the estate, Leah stood at the center of them, her heart heavy but resolute. They had fought for this moment, had bled for it, and now it was theirs. They were free, and no one, not even the world outside, could take that from them. But the price of their freedom had been high. They had killed the Howards, and with their death, they had severed the final tie that bound them to the past. The legacy of the Howards, once so powerful, had crumbled, but in its wake, there was a new world to build, and that world, Leah knew, would not come easy. For now, they had their freedom, and that, in itself, was a victory. But Leah understood that the true fight was just beginning. The battle for survival, for dignity, for a future that was theirs to shape, would not be won with a single act of vengeance. It would be won through sweat, through blood, and through a strength they had only just begun to tap into. And as the night fell, Leah made a silent promise to herself and to the others. They would fight for their future. They would rebuild. They would make a life for themselves, free from the chains of the past. The Howards were dead. But their legacy of oppression would not stand for much longer, and Leah, with her heart full of fire and vengeance, would ensure that it was so. The days that followed the Howards' deaths were filled with a strange mix of anticipation and dread. The plantation, now abandoned, stood like a hollow monument to the past. The once gleaming house was now dark and cold, its walls crumbling with the weight of history. The lands that had once been tilled by the enslaved hands of Leah and her fellow rebels were now free, but still tainted by the years of bloodshed and suffering. Leah stood on the edge of the fields, her eyes scanning the horizon as the other slaves began to organize. The rebellion was still fresh in their minds, their victory hard-earned, and yet the question remained. What now? What did freedom mean if there was no place to call home, no structure to uphold the hard-won victory? The first few days after the rebellion had been spent in a daze. The masters were dead, the estate was in their hands, but they had nothing to build on. The Howards had taken everything with them: wealth, status, and the power that had once held them above all others. And now, as Leah looked at the sprawling fields before her, she realized that the land was both a blessing and a curse. The sugarcane had been their labor, but now it would have to be their livelihood. The land that had once been the source of their torment was now their key to survival. But that came with its own set of challenges. They had the power, but they lacked the tools, the knowledge, and the resources to make it work. Zainab, always the pragmatic one, had already begun organizing the slaves into work groups. They were the backbone of the plantation, and now they would be the ones to carry it forward. But even she could sense the uncertainty that hung in the air. Freedom was a double-edged sword, and with it came not only opportunity but immense responsibility. "We can't just sit here and wait," Zainab said, her voice filled with quiet urgency. "We need to gather supplies, find a way to build what we need." Leah nodded, her eyes focused on the distant horizon. "And we need to make sure that we're not alone. The world outside may not welcome us with open arms. We have to be ready for whatever comes." But Leah couldn't shake the feeling that something darker was waiting for them. She had seen the way the world worked, had seen how quickly the masters' anger could turn to violence. They had killed the Howards, but they had no idea what kind of repercussions that would bring. The plantation may have fallen into their hands, but they had no way of knowing whether the other slaveholders would come for them, or worse, the authorities would send soldiers to crush their rebellion. As the days passed, the former slaves worked together to secure the plantation. They built shelters from the materials left behind by the Howards, repurposing old tools and scraps to make something of their own. They tended to the fields, planting what they could, preparing for the seasons ahead. But despite the sense of accomplishment that came with rebuilding, there was an underlying tension that none of them could ignore. Leah had become the unofficial leader, the one the others turned to for guidance. But even as she stood at the front of the group, giving orders and making decisions, she could feel the weight of the responsibility pressing down on her. She had led them through the rebellion, had fought for their freedom, but now that it was theirs, what would she do with it? She had no answers. All she knew was that the fight had only just begun. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Leah stood at the edge of the fields once more, watching as the sky turned crimson. The air was thick with the scent of freshly tilled earth, but beneath that, there was something else, something darker. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to find Zainab approaching, her face set in a grim expression. "We have a problem," Zainab said, her voice low. Leah's heart skipped a beat. "What kind of problem?" "There's word coming in from the neighboring plantations. The slaveholders are starting to talk. They've heard about what happened here, and they're not happy about it. Some of them are already making plans to retaliate." Leah's chest tightened. "How bad is it?" "We don't know yet," Zainab said, her eyes dark with concern. "But we can't ignore it. They'll come for us. We're not safe here." Leah took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She had known this day would come, but now that it was here, she couldn't shake the feeling that everything they had worked for was about to be destroyed. "We need to prepare," Leah said, her voice hardening with resolve. "We can't afford to wait any longer. If they come for us, we fight. We don't back down." Zainab nodded, but the worry in her eyes remained. "And if they're too strong?" Leah's eyes narrowed. Then we find a way to make them weak. We'll fight. We'll do whatever it takes. Cried. The next few days were filled with preparations. The former slaves worked tirelessly, building defenses, gathering supplies, and fortifying their position. The Howards' mansion had once been a symbol of wealth and power, but now it was their stronghold, the place where they would make their stand. But even as they worked, Leah couldn't shake the sense that time was running out. The fear of retaliation hung heavy in the air, and though the others did their best to stay hopeful, Leah knew the reality of the situation. They had taken the plantation, but they had no idea what kind of force was coming for them. They were fighting not just for their survival, but for the future of their people. As the sun set on another day, Leah stood at the edge of the field, her heart heavy with the weight of what was to come. She had fought for freedom, for vengeance, but now the true test had arrived, and she would not back down. Not now. Not ever. The days following their preparation had been marked by uneasy quiet. The slaves worked relentlessly, strengthening their defenses, gathering every weapon they could find, and preparing for the battle that Leah knew would come. The night was always the hardest, long and heavy, filled with the constant hum of worry. The fear of retaliation weighed on them all. They were free, yes, but they had taken something from the masters, and those who had once held dominion over the land would not let that go unchallenged. Leah stood outside the perimeter they had established around the estate, her eyes trained on the horizon. The land stretched out before her, its fields sprawling as far as the eye could see. Once, it had been a symbol of captivity, of oppression. But now, it was a symbol of their rebellion, a battleground where the war for their freedom was far from over. The Howards were dead, their legacy extinguished in a single act of vengeance, but the other slaveholders, the other masters, would not let their actions go unanswered. Leah had heard rumors of soldiers being dispatched, of reinforcements being gathered. The masters would not stop until they had reclaimed what they believed was rightfully theirs. But Leah was no longer the frightened slave she had been. She had tasted freedom, and she would not let anyone take it from her. "You're watching for them, aren't you?" Zainab's voice broke through the quiet of the night, soft but firm. She had approached Leah quietly, her presence a silent strength behind Leah's own resolve. Leah nodded without looking at her. Her gaze remained fixed on the distant fields, as though she could see the approaching danger already. "They're coming. I can feel it." Zainab stepped closer, her boots crunching softly on the earth beneath them. "How do you plan to fight them?" Leah turned to face her friend, her face grim, her eyes hard. "We'll fight like we did before. But this time, we'll be ready. We won't back down, and cave at that it in never murms." Zainab's eyes searched Leah's face, her brow furrowed with concern. "And if they're too strong? If we can't hold them off?" Leah's jaw tightened. "Then, we'll make them feel the cost of their pride. If we fall together. But they won't get away unscathed. We'll make sure of that." Zainab looked at her, silent for a moment, then nodded. "You're right. We've fought for everything, and we can't give up now. We'll hold the line." The two women stood together in the growing dusk, their hearts heavy with the weight of what was to come. They were no longer just slaves, they were warriors, defenders of their freedom. But Leah knew that the real battle had only just begun. The first wave of their enemies might be just the beginning. If the masters came, they would come with everything they had. The sound of hooves reached their ears long before they saw the riders. The cavalry, perhaps a dozen strong, were approaching fast. Leah's breath caught in her chest as the shapes grew clearer against the setting Sunday. Her hand instinctively reached for the knife she had hidden at her waist. She was ready. Ready to fight? To defend. To protect the life they had fought so hard to gain. The men on horseback approached, their dark silhouettes cutting through the orange glow of the evening. There was no need for words. The confrontation was inevitable. Leah stepped forward, her body tense, every muscle coiled like a spring. She could hear the others gathering behind her, the slaves they had freed, now standing together as one. The cavalry stopped at the edge of the estate, Their leader, a tall, broad-shouldered man wearing the uniform of a soldier, looked at them with a sneer. "You think you can hold this place?" he called out, his voice full of mockery. "This land will never be yours. You're nothing but beasts, and you will be crushed underfoot." Leah felt a rush of anger flood through her, but she kept her composure. "This land is ours now," she called back, her voice clear, unyielding. "We've fought for it, and we won't give it up. Not to you, not to anyone." The leader's sneer faltered for a moment, but he quickly regained his confidence. "You're brave for slaves, but that bravery will cost you." Without warning, he raised his hand, and the cavalry surged forward, their horses charging toward the estate with terrifying speed. But the slaves had been waiting. They had prepared. The first line of defense was already in place, and as the cavalry advanced, they found themselves suddenly under fire. Arrows shot from the trees, striking down 2 riders before they could react. The slaves had been resourceful, using the land to their advantage, setting traps and using the terrain to their benefit. Leah's heart pounded as the battle began in earnest. She could hear the clash of metal, the screams of the wounded, and the sound of hooves stomping through the earth. But Leah's focus was on the leader, the one who had come to crush their rebellion. He was charging toward her now, sword raised high, his eyes filled with rage. She didn't hesitate. She stepped forward, her knife gleaming in the fading light. The two of them collided in a blur of movement, the sound of metal meeting, metal ringing out across the field. Leah's heart pounded as she parried his first blow, then struck back with a quick slash of her own. He blocked it, but she saw the opening, a slight shift in his stance. She was faster, she was stronger. With a sudden, powerful thrust, Leah drove the knife into his side. He let out a roar of pain, stumbling back, but Leah was already moving. She closed the distance in a heartbeat, and with a swift, brutal motion, she drove the blade up under his ribs, ending it in one quick, decisive blow. The leader's body crumpled to the ground, his sword falling from his grip as he gasped for breath. His eyes locked with Leah's, a look of disbelief in them as he breathed his last. Behind her, the battle continued, but Leah knew that this victory would turn the tide. The Howards were dead, the cavalry was in retreat, and the plantation was theirs to protect. The slaves had proven their strength, their unity, and their resolve. But the fight was far from over. The world had watched them rise, and now they would fight to keep their place in it.